the Senate Bill 2109. There's a concern I have about the way Senator Kyle and McCain have tried to pressure the Navajo Nation to sign the legislation with the renewal of the NGS site lease contract and the Kayenta mine contract in order to release about 6,400 acre-feet of water to the Navajo communities of Window Rock, St. Michael's, and Fort Defiance. The senators are asking for the Navajo Nation to renew this. They're saying that this is on part of from the Central Arizona Project is pressuring them to pressure the Navajo Nation. This might be in violation of other existing international law, perhaps the Convention Against Racism and Discrimination. The Arizona citizens in this area are being discriminated against in that way. Two more points real quickly. I have a minute. Another session of this type might include information on other international laws that can be applied or besides the declaration. And third, in future meetings, maybe we can have each group sign up for one slot. There's a lot of issues that need to be talked about, and I've heard from several groups multiple times, and the points are good, but they've been repeated. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So that concludes our open forum. We have about a half hour. I did want to recognize from the President's office, Karen Francis Begay, and Karen is Special Advisor, Navajo, and works very closely with the President representing his office. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim for concluding remarks.
Thank you. Again, thank you all for your very important contributions to this discussion, for taking the time to be here, sharing your thoughts, stories, and aspirations. Of course, I want to again reiterate my thanks to the organizers, my home institution, University of Arizona, the IPLP program, in particular the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, the individuals who have given their time and effort to the success of this meeting, and also to our co-sponsors, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission, National Congress of American Indians, and the Tohono O'odham Nation.
And NCAI.
And I said National Congress of American Indians. I thought I did.
Okay, very
National
good.
Congress of American
You're
Indians,
right.
NCAI,
Yeah.
for those of you who
I just want to make sure we get them
acronyms, and the Ford Foundation for its generous support for this meeting. I can't really say how deeply moved I am by what I've heard, even though it's been from multiple perspectives, and often without sending the same message or identical point of view. Nonetheless, what I think is important is that what we've had here is a conversation around certain constants, certain constant values that we have heard repeated again and again and again, that have to do with those rights that everybody has expressed in one way or another. Rights beginning with or centered on the right to self-determination. We've heard that expressed in many ways, self-determination in many ways, in conjunction with or in connection with the importance of culture and the relationship that has to the very existence of indigenous peoples, and the spiritual, religious dimension of culture, and how that connects with all aspects of indigenous lives. And along with the discussion of rights as a constant in this conversation, there's been the repeated call to remember responsibilities. And I think that's extremely important to understand that with these rights come responsibilities on the part of peoples, indigenous peoples included, and on the part of indigenous governments, and on the part of each of us as individuals, each person, each human being, each member of communities, including indigenous communities, responsibilities along with those rights. So with this conversation, I think we see that there are these constants despite or alongside these different perspectives, which are natural, of course, given the diversity in the room and the diversity among indigenous peoples in this country and across the globe. This conversation is one that has been going on for a long time, but that in many ways has not been, or that has not been heard by the world as it should. And my hope is that this conversation will continue to grow and extend evermore to include governments of states, that is nation states, including the government of the United States, in a more meaningful sense than it has extended to include the governments of the nation states of the world. That it will extend to include the larger society of the governments or states within which indigenous peoples live. And that will extend such that these values that we share, that we hear, that are about rights and responsibilities, can eventually translate into the reality of day-to-day life. The Declaration both affirms rights and is a reminder of the denial of those rights. And that's what this conversation around the Declaration, I think, has highlighted. The affirmation of these rights, that constant that I referred to, of understanding of these values, but the denial of those rights, the ongoing gap between this affirmation and the reality of everyday life of indigenous peoples. We've heard stories about that gap. We've heard stories about that ongoing denial of rights. Moving stories, as I said before, but still stories of hope in each case. And it's that hope for that closing of that gap, that movement towards a reality where these rights are more than just expressions on paper. They're more than just statements, lofty statements made in the halls of the United Nations or sometimes in the halls of government, but that actually translate into reality in the everyday lives of indigenous peoples. When I first thought about a visit to the United States, it was around the effort to get the U.S. to endorse or support the Declaration at a time when it was not supporting the Declaration. Indeed, it had voted against it when the Declaration was before the UN General Assembly. When I became Rapporteur in 2008, it was just a few months after the Declaration had been adopted by the General Assembly in 2007, on September 13. I remember that day sitting in the halls of the General Assembly with many others who had been working on the Declaration over literally decades. And when that voting board flashed on the screen in the hall, in the General Assembly hall, with the affirmative votes, it was extremely moving. And we passed from a time when the affirmation of rights in a declaration was a dream to a time when it was a reality. It was literally an instant. And I must say that up until that moment, those of us in the room, many of us, still had our doubts about what was going to happen. We thought it was going to be an affirmative vote, but you know, because of the difficulties, especially in those latter months, those latter years, we all had our doubts. So when we passed that from that moment where the Declaration was still an aspiration to the moment when it was a reality, it was an extremely moving one. But it, of course, at the same time was a huge disappointment that a few countries, a few states, had voted against the Declaration. 4 countries, only 4, but 4 significant ones, the United States among them. So it was part of my hope as I became UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and as someone who had advocated for the Declaration, to see that eventually change. And one by one, those governments did reverse positions. It was because that conversation towards the adoption of the Declaration was continuing, that conversation which had taken states to a position of reluctance about recognizing indigenous people's rights, a reluctance that had lasted literally centuries, to a point of affirming indigenous people's rights in the Declaration. That conversation was continuing with those governments that still had voted against the Declaration, and eventually moved them. Of course, there were political changes, meaningful political changes, that figured in the mix. But those governments were moved towards an endorsement of the Declaration. And we can lament somewhat about the fact that each of those endorsements or expressions of support came with some qualification. But nonetheless, those qualifications were in the same nature as the explanations of votes by other governments that had voted in favor of the declaration in the General Assembly. The main point was they supported, in principle, the declaration, each of these governments, and they affirmed the core principles in the declaration, including the right of self-determination, rights over lands and resources, right to culture, right to education, health, development, all these rights that we've been discussing. That was the main point. And so I had been involved in discussions with the government of the United States to see how to try to address some of the concerns that the government was expressing about the declaration, to see if there could be a reversal of that position. And I was just a small part of that effort. It was indigenous leaders who, in the country. It was organizations like the NCAI. It was organizations like the International Indian Treaty Council, like the Indian Law Resource Center, that were at the forefront, really, of these initiatives to see the government reverse its position. And that eventually did happen. And so the next set of conversations I had with the government was, what about something in the United States where we could pursue now a conversation about how to implement the declaration, what it would mean in the context of the United States. And initially, I didn't get much of a response about that idea. It took a few months before that discussion led to the idea of a visit like this nature. And we discussed the visit in terms of more than simply a set of discussions in Washington about the declaration, to a full country visit of the kind that I do as UN Special Rapporteur, to assess the situation of indigenous peoples under all relevant human rights standards. Now, this visit features the declaration, and this conference has featured the declaration because it's a relatively new instrument in the life of the United States and in the life of indigenous peoples of this country. It's a relatively new instrument, and quite frankly, not that well known throughout Indian country. And I want to see, and hope we all want to see, that change. We want to see the declaration become more known and its utility better understood. And this conference, I think, goes a long way in that direction. It's also not an instrument well known within government, despite the endorsement by the United States. And we can talk about the president endorsing it, but it's one thing for the president to endorse it, it's another thing to make its way down into the operational aspects of each part of the government, which is, is a very complex and multifaceted entity. Those of you who had anything to do with the federal government understand that well. So this conversation around the declaration, which we're having here, like I said, I'm hoping it will continue to grow, to include more indigenous people, to embrace the government, not just at the highest levels, but at certain levels, State Department, but at the various operational levels of the federal government. That it will grow to embrace the courts, that I think someone called them the suits, the lawyers, right? And I'm one of them, and I wear a suit every now and then, of course. We'll start to engage in that. We'll start to be part of this conversation. Here at the University of Arizona College of Law, we try to orient our students who are studying federal Indian law, not just those who are looking at the human rights arena and working at the international level, but those who are fully intent to stay here in the country, working directly with tribes, representing them before the courts, representing them before federal agencies. We talk about how to incorporate the Declaration and other relevant human rights standards in their advocacy, so they don't become one of these suits that you have to orient with regard to the relevance of the Declaration. And hopefully that will occur. That will occur more and more. So, just to conclude, we're not anywhere near the end of this conversation, of course. This is just a small part of it. My work as Special Rapporteur is a contribution to it. I hope to, within the framework of my work as Special Rapporteur, assist to catalyze that conversation a bit. And of course, it should include not just the Declaration. The Declaration is the most direct affirmation of indigenous people's right and most explicit affirmation that we have at the international level. But it's not the only affirmation of rights that relate to indigenous peoples. There are several other instruments that we have to keep in mind, and they've been mentioned in our discussions, including the treaties to which the human rights treaties to which the United States is a party, particularly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, very important human rights treaties that, in a sense, ground the principles that are in the Declaration, ground the principles of self-determination, equality, right to culture, which are incorporated in these treaties. So my hope is that this work will help to catalyze this conversation, and that conversation in turn will move to action, as we've been talking about, move to closing this gap between the expression of these rights and their realization on the ground. As you know, this mandate of Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one established by the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is an entity made up of governments, of states, of UN member states, 47 of them. And the council, this council, which includes the United States, the United States is one of these, has established these different special rapporteurs, including the one on racism. There's one on violence against women. There's one on the right to food, which is very important to the discussion of the food sovereignty issues. There's one on right to health, very important to that discussion. One on right to housing. And there's one on the rights of indigenous peoples. And each of these special rapporteurs has as its function trying to catalyze conversations about human rights in our respective areas of concern. And we have the mandate to do that from the governments themselves. You know, sometimes we're looked at with some suspicion because we're appointed by the governments. We're appointed by the very governments that we then, in a sense, investigate, that we then evaluate. But we're appointed as independent experts, and that's explicit in our appointment. So I am not to take any instructions from any government, including the United States, or maybe especially the United States. Instead, I'm to do my work on an independent basis. So not only can I do that, I'm supposed to do that. And that means listening to you without worrying about whether the government might like it or not, without worrying about whether what I might say might sit politically well or not with any particular interest. It's about telling the truth. It's about telling the truth about what has happened, what is happening, and then about what you, the people, aspire to happen. And then on that basis to give my evaluation and recommendations, which will necessarily be inspired by discussions like these. I do feel it is a tremendous responsibility to do this work. I take very much to heart the expressions that I've heard about the expectations for this work. I can only say that I and those who in a very dedicated way work with me can pledge our utmost to do what we can to move things along towards the realization of rights, to help close that gap that we've talked about, to take us from this condition of violation of rights to one of realization of rights. So thank you very much to the elders, to the grandmothers, to the Autumn people on whose land we sit, we are meeting, and to all of those who've come and shared this time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks. And so we're going to finish on time. You've been a wonderfully well-behaved audience. And you have been. My students have come up and said, everybody's been so nice. So we appreciate that. I want to particularly thank the Special Rapporteur giving us, the University of Arizona, the opportunity to host this phenomenal event, this very important event. I want to thank Maya Campbell from the Office of the High Commissioner. We've coordinated with her. I particularly want to thank our panelists, people like Suzanne Schoenharjo and some of the other panelists who are very, very busy and to come here and just share with us just for 10 minutes because they know the time constraints, but their contributions were just so wonderful and so important. I want to thank them. And I would like for all of you to thank, most importantly, the conference coordinator, Shauna Howard here, who put this all together. And our volunteers, Julie, the students, if you'd also give them a hand as well. They work very hard, so thank you. I have asked my friend Dennis Manuel from Tohono O'odham. Is Dennis here? Did he just leave? Oh, there he is. Good. If Dennis is Tohono O'odham, as Josephina says, I've been working with these folks on some sacred sites issue here, and Dennis probably knows as much about O'odham sacred lands as anybody I've met, and so it's my honor to ask him to close this event with a prayer.